In an amazing Foreign Service career, Nicholas Burns has been U.S. Ambassador to Greece, also to NATO under President Bill Clinton, top advisor to both Presidents George H.W. Bush and Clinton on the Soviet Union, and then as it became Russia. He's been Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs for President George W. Bush. He's been stationed in Mauritania, Egypt, and Israel, among other postings. You're now Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Politics at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. You write regularly for the Boston Globe. You are in Western Massachusetts to address the Springfield Public Forum, and we are so honored to have you spend some time with us, sir. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be in Springfield.
Mr. Ambassador, you are here to talk about war and revolution in the Middle East, and sadly, but could not pick a safer topic in the sense of there'll always be something to talk about. The day you are here with us, Russia has begun bombing in Syria. They are presenting it as bombing against ISIS forces. Our government is saying all indications are it is in fact against the opponents of the Assad regime, which the United States opposes. Secretary John Kerry at the UN today expressed grave concern about what's happening. Your sense of where this goes, and can this end without further horror and bloodshed? So much trouble already in Syria, refugees trying to get out for weeks and months. Can we see, will we see, do you fear, for the U.S.-Russian confrontation?
I think we'll see a political difference between the United States and Russia. I don't think we'll see a military confrontation. We're hopefully both too smart for that. You know, we're the two strongest countries in the world militarily. We're both nuclear weapons power. So there's a very careful balance between the two of them. But I do think that Syria is the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world today. There are 22.4 million Syrians, and 11 million of them are homeless. So imagine half of the United States population having lost their homes, either living in refugee camp, or a lot of Syrians are just on the run. They're out, you know, traveling, trying to avoid the Syrian government, which is firing barrel bombs into their cities to terrorize the civilian population, trying to avoid the Islamic State, which in northern Syria is now the power. And so the refugee part of this is the most acute problem. It's the one that has to be dealt with first. And then there are other problems that you mentioned, the fact that the government only controls the abhorrent government, 20% of the territory. There are all sorts of rebel groups, left and right, running around, firing at each other. It's a chaotic situation, and it's bleeding into Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Turkey. So it's quite quickly become a regional war, and that's one of the dangers to the United States. That's why we need to not put troops in, but we certainly need to be more active in trying to organize the rest of the world to care for the refugees and try to strengthen some of the moderate rebel groups to oppose both the Islamic State and the Syrian government.
Again, as you are here with us, within recent days at the UN, President Obama, Russian President Putin, did have meetings, which at least the public view of them, they seem to be pretty stiff, not terribly comfortable with each other. There's some trouble going back there. President Putin says basically, just getting rid of the authoritarian regimes like Assad in that part of the world has tended to create openings for greater terror, sanctuaries for terrorists like ISIS. President Obama says, as you have just pointed out, we have a regime that is killing its own people. That can never be a good thing to support. The ongoing argument goes on and on.
Well, I think President Obama and President Putin don't like each other. That's very clear. But more importantly than personal feelings, our two governments are diametrically opposed on how we think the world should be ordered, how governments should treat their own people. President Putin is an authoritarian leader. That's a nice word for dictator. There are no civil liberties to speak of in Russia. He calls the shots, and he supports like-minded governments like that. And President Assad's government in Syria is also a dictatorship. President Putin's view, as you said, is that these existing governments need to be supported because there's chaos if they fall. But the problem here is the Syrian government has caused the majority of the casualties, the deaths and the wounded in Syria. 260,000 people have been killed since the start of the war 4.5 years ago. And so the U.S. position has been, we can't countenance a continuation in power of the Assad government. We can't support it. And we've got to try to arrange a political transition, hopefully through negotiations, and Secretary Kerry's leading that, so the Syrian people don't have to live under such an abhorrent government.
Take the picture a little broader, if I may. A bipartisan congressional committee, the Homeland Security, recently criticized the Obama administration pretty severely for the handling, or really, as they were saying, almost lack of handling of the situation with ISIS terrorists in particular. For some time, a lot's been made of the president months ago saying, we really are still on the drawing board. We really don't have a plan. And ISIS is a particularly intractable problem, it would seem. But we know in the last year or so, according to, again, this congressional report, it appears ISIS has roughly doubled the numbers of people ready to act for it internationally. Fair criticism coming out there of the administration, do you think?
I think it's a little harsh. I think President Obama's done a lot of good things in foreign policy. I've supported much of what he's done. In this case, the president clearly does not want to get the United States enmeshed in the Syrian war. He's backed away time and again from recommendations that we commit ourselves either with airstrikes or heavier arming of the rebel groups there. I don't think he has a coherent strategy right now. I will be that critical and say that we need one. Because if the United States, and we're still the strongest country in the world, isn't active, and again, I'm not speaking militarily, but more as a political leader, creating coalitions of countries to intervene in a situation like this, then you leave the door open for despots like Putin, who is very happy to fill this vacuum with this very dramatic increase of Russian surface-to-air missiles and aircraft in Syria itself. So I think the United States needs to be more active. We can help unite Turkey, which is a neighboring country, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, some of the other Arab countries. They ought to be doing most of the funding of these moderate rebel groups. They ought to be working together, which they're not doing right now. And if we can do that, and if we can simultaneously try to launch political negotiations that might lead to a transitional government, meaning a new government in Syria that might be more broad-based, comprised of all the different moderate forces in the country, that may take a long time, but it's probably the way this war is going to end. The great majority of wars don't end on the battlefield, they end at a negotiating table. So I think Secretary Kerry and President Obama have been right to push that. But the United States hasn't played its typical leadership role. It shows. Without the U.S. being involved, sometimes we find chaos instead of resolutions to problems.
Let me take us for our last minute or two in a somewhat different direction. Still the Middle East. When most of us say in this country the Middle East, we think Israel. In your estimation, and you have served in both Israel and Egypt in diplomatic posts, can there ever really be an answer to the problems between Israel, Palestinians, Hamas, and everybody who supports all of these various parties when the basic crux of the issue really seems to be the land that all of these parties want? Land that is sacred to three great religions of the world, the city of Jerusalem with sacred areas to all of these people, land that has been taken, refugees created through the years on the Arab side in particular. Yitzhak Rabin tried to make concessions. He was assassinated, and a lot of people think that was maybe the last time there was an Israeli leader that was in a position to reach across and make the kind of deals and be trusted by the other side. Will anyone ever be able to find the answer for all sides to accept and bring a lasting peace there?
I think yes. I don't think that any problem around the world is unresolvable. Now, this one's been going on a long time, 6.5 decades since the creation of the State of Israel and the dispersal of the Palestinians who lost their land. It's going to take a strong-willed and a visionary Israeli leader. It's going to take moderate Palestinians who are willing to accept the continued existence of Israel. It's going to take a determined mediator like the United States. We're the only country that both of them will trust. And all those stars have to come into alignment. If you traced various efforts over the last 6-7 decades, you see that sometimes you have the Palestinian leader but not the Israeli, sometimes vice versa. Sometimes American presidents like Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter are willing to dive into this problem. Some presidents are more standoffish. At some point the stars will be aligned, but it won't be soon. Because right now I think the emergence of the Islamic State, this vicious terrorist group that now controls about 1/3 of Syria and about 1/3 of Iraq, that's the greater problem now that the Israelis and the Arab countries are focused on. And the irony of this conflict is that the Israelis and the Arab countries are beginning to work together behind the scenes against the Islamic State. The Arab countries won't say that publicly because they get into trouble with their own populations. But they're all in the same boat. And there's a famous adage in the Middle East, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, The enemy of the Islamic State, of course, is both Israel and the moderate Arab states. They're beginning to coalesce because neither Israel nor the moderate Arab countries want to see a further growth in the power of the Islamic State. A lot rides on the effectiveness of the United States Air Force because we've been conducting bombing campaigns from Kuwait and now Turkey for the last year and a half. We've been able to contain the Islamic State but not defeat it. That will only happen when there's a significant ground force. It shouldn't be American soldiers. We've paid our dues in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the Arab countries, the Iraqi army, need to reconstitute themselves. They need to do that job on the ground. It's then I think you'll see a diminution in the power of the Islamic State, and maybe at some point thereafter, the Israelis and Palestinians will come back to serious conversations about peace, but not in the short term.
Ambassador Nicholas Burns, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you. Thanks very much.